In this video, we will discuss public-private partnerships in education. The funding of state-run higher education institutions continues its 30-year decline, and there is no end in sight. Austerity is the reality we have been living with here in the United States for the last 30 years, and higher education is an easy target. As funding for state institutions keeps shrinking, new opportunities for funding must be explored. Regardless of the political climate brought on by the current White House, neoliberal economic policies that support privatization and deregulation to help shrink the role of government are not going away anytime soon. And one concept that is just starting to be embraced on a large scale in the United States is the practice of public-private partnerships, sometimes called PPPs or P3 deals. Public-private partnerships are generally associated with big transportation projects like airports and roads. They've been embraced in Canada and the UK. Heathrow Airport is a public-private partnership. But P3 deals can be made in many sectors of industry, including higher education. Currently, there is a market in public-private partnership investment funds that represents annual investments in the ballpark of $50 to $65 billion a year. The presence of P3 deals in the U.S. is going to grow quite substantially under the current leadership in Washington. As of early 2018, President Trump's $1.5 trillion infrastructure plan is set up to rely heavily on public-private partnerships. A P3 deal on something like a major highway is easy to understand in the simplest way because if you build a highway, you can always put a toll on the road. And what is an airport but a gigantic system of roads with planes thrown in? When it comes to something like building at a state university, how does the P3 deal work? Now, although public-private partnership deals are more rare in the United States, these deals do already exist pretty high up the federal ladder. In fact, the Military Housing Privatization Initiative that the U.S. Department of Defense has been using to update over 180,000 military housing units on bases across the country has been going on since 1996. The way it works for the Department of Defense is the military branch identifies a piece of land or an existing on-base housing development and leases the property to a developer for 50 years. The developer is in charge of the funding and the building or renovation of the units that are military preferred. That is to say, the homes are not limited to military occupancy. Inventory can be leased to the general public at a market rate if military occupancy dips. Overall, the Military Housing Privatization Initiative is quite significant and successful. Did you know that the U.S. Department of Defense privatized 98% of its housing by 2012? Now, shortly after the market crash of 2008, several colleges and universities in the United States decided to forego issuing bonds for big capital projects and instead went for public-private partnership deals for things that big donors don't generally choose to sponsor, like dormitories and parking garages. Include buildings with classrooms and also include buildings with classrooms and labs. But these deals can also include buildings with classrooms and labs. How does it work? P3 deals in higher education look a lot like the P3 deals at the Department of Defense. The institution leases the land to the developer for the typical life of a building, 30 to 35 years. The developer builds and, depending on the deal, manages the property for the life of the contract. At the end of the agreement, ownership reverts back to the institution. Keep in mind that This is the most basic simplification of how it works because a huge amount of effort goes into the contract and partnership. Oftentimes an LLC is established with the institution as part owner. The benefit of the P3 deal is that the project gets funded and built in a timely manner, a lot quicker than if the funding had to be identified through donors or a bond issue. In the case of a dorm or a parking deck, revenues from the property generally go directly to the management company, with the institution signing a long-term lease. Shortly after the market crash of 2008, several universities in the United States decided to forego issuing bonds. Here are some examples of the type of deals that have been going on in the last decade or so. Montclair State University built a $211 million dormitory called The Heights through a public-private partnership deal, opening up the campus to an additional 2,000 dorm occupants. At the time that the finished project was unveiled in 2011, after it took only 14 months to build, Montclair State President Susan A. Cole said, "The state of New Jersey has not invested any direct capital funding in higher educational facilities in more than 25 years. Therefore, in order to grow and develop as a competitive university, we have had to find creative and cost-effective solutions to build new facilities and make capital improvements to existing structures." UC Davis built its West Village complex much the same way, leveraging its $11 million investment into a $280 million project. Ohio State University privatized its parking operations, entered a $1 billion energy operation, and launched an ed tech initiative with Apple computers to put an iPad in the hand of every incoming freshman, all through P3 deals. The University of Kentucky just completed its $900 million expansion through a P3 deal, and UC Merced is in the midst of a whopping $1.9 million campus expansion through, you guessed it, a P3 deal. While the public-private partnership does give new hope to institutions in states suffering dearly from austerity measures, it is important to keep in mind that these deals are with companies that are trying to turn a profit. What happens when something goes wrong? The state of Indiana had to step in to help complete construction on Route 69 after the Spanish company in charge of the build, Insulux Corson, missed several deadlines while facing bankruptcy. That was a deal set up when current Vice President Mike Pence was the governor of Indiana. While the concept of a P3 deal is kind of like a long-term lease agreement, in reality, these are very sophisticated contracts. You will recall schools and states dug themselves into a financial hole with the interest rate swap loans of the early 2000s. Regardless of how enthusiastic states and institutions are with these borrowing vehicles, the possibility of something going wrong does not go away. Companies fail and merge and change direction over the decades. What happens during the last decade of a contract when the company is ready to step away from managing a campus property? Will they keep up with the maintenance as well as they did the first 10 years of the contract? What about loopholes? If a private company determines the cost of housing and they are basically the only game on campus, how does that affect cost for the students? If a big chunk of public institutions are funded and managed primarily by private companies, what does that make the state institution? Does the definition of a state university change? I guess we'll have to wait to find out.